So good morning, everyone. We're so pleased to see so many of you in attendance for our 6th Grand Dialogue event. My name is Doug Kinchy. I'm the project director for the Grand Dialogue, and am happy to welcome you here. For how many of this is the first time you've been to a Grand Dialogue? Wow. Very good. And let's get the compliment of that set. How many of you have been here before? About half and half. Very good. Okay, for those who haven't been here before, I'm going to do a little introduction to I see people coming. Could you raise your hands again if you have an empty seat? If you see a raised hand, that's an empty seat. For those of you that are just coming. Okay, thank you. For those of you that haven't been here before, I'm going to just do a little bit of an introduction to the Grand Dialogue. Thank you. The Grand Dialogue in Science and Religion for the Greater Grand Rapids area was begun with a grant that we received. It is an interinstitutional, interdisciplinary, interfaith exploration. Our goal is to seek positive ways of relating these two great ideas. The premise of the Grand Dialogue is that science and religion are the two major forces in our society. The nature of the relationship between these two great forces is of critical importance to our society. Alfred North Whitehead phrased it in very good terms. He said, when we consider what religion is for mankind and what science is, it is no exaggeration to say that the future course of history depends upon the relations between them. We have here the two strongest general forces which influence humanity. They seem to be set one against the other, the force of our religious institutions and the force of our impulse to accurate observation and logical deduction. The strategy of the Grand Dialogue is to bring people and institutions together to share ideas and perspectives. We have a number of institutional members, including Aquinas and Calvin College, Calvin Theological Seminary, the Catholic Information Center, Cornerstone University, Grand Valley State University, Hope College, Western Theological Seminary, and the Interfaith Dialogue Association. The goal of the Grand Dialogue is that the participating organizations each have their own unique perspective, foci, message, and intended audience. But by cooperating, we affirm the willingness to be open to the various issues and perspectives in a spirit of mutual respect. We have a website, which I assume most of you have found if you registered via that, granddialogue.org. Our previous conferences, to give you some background, began in 2005 with Michael Roos, who spoke to us on All in the Family, the struggle in America between evolution and creation. In 2006, we had Professor John Hott, who spoke on Darwin, intelligence, and religion, how much can evolution explain? In 2007, Phil Clayton spoke to us on body, mind, and spirit, emerging perspectives in science and religion. In 2008, Howard Van Til spoke on Is the Cosmos All There Is? The quest for answers to big cosmological questions. And last year we had Brian Malley, who spoke to us on Why Do People Believe in Gods? Someone who's been active in the cognitive science of religion. This year we are pleased to bring to you Alan Wallace. Dr. Wallace has his bachelor's degree in physics, which he got in his 30s. And I'll tell you why it was that way in a few minutes. I hope I'm not stealing any of his thunder. But Alan Wallace did a junior year abroad as a college student, and while there discovered the tradition of Tibetan Buddhism and didn't go back to college. He instead got a one-way ticket to India and explored for over 14 years the Buddhist tradition and became a Buddhist monk and was ordained by the Dalai Lama. Following that, then, he decided that he wanted to take his ideas that he had learned and try to integrate with Western thought, and so came back to the United States, finished his degree at Amherst University in physics, then went on and received his PhD in religious studies from Stanford University. He is currently the president of the Santa Barbara Institute for Consciousness Studies. As I indicated, he has been a translator with the Dalai Lama. This is a picture of him when he was a bit younger with the Dalai Lama. He's also an author, or editor, or translator of more than 30 books. The Attention Revolution, Unlocking the Power of the Focused Mind, which, by the way, is the book he recommended, and there's still, I think, 5 copies of that available at the book stand afterwards. The rest of the books that we ordered are already almost all sold out already, but you can find his books at Amazon or other bookstores. But a very prolific author as well. He wanted to make sure he had enough time, so I'm going to let him get started early. So it's my pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Alan Wallace, who will speak to us on experience, reason, and faith in science and religion, a Buddhist perspective. Dr. Wallace.
Good morning. Is my voice amplified? It seems it is. You can hear me in the back? No. Right, let's do it like this. There we go. How about now? Aha. How about in the back now? Can you hear me? Not so well. So is there simply no amplification? There is not. Aha. Well, it worked a little while ago. Red light is on. That's right by my mouth. So,
try this.
Looks like we'll need to, yeah. Interesting. It worked 5 minutes ago. All right.
Why don't you leave it on? We'll see if there's something.
Yeah, but more convenient, yeah, because I like to have my hands free. It works now, yes? Oh, yeah. So good morning, all. It's very much of an honor to be one of the many distinguished speakers. I'm not one of the distinguished ones, but we saw the ones that came before in this grand dialogue, and I think indeed it's very well named. To my mind, there are a few more important types of dialogue that we can engage in this modern world of ours than the dialogue between science and religion. Another very important one is meaningful, mutually respectful, charitable dialogues from one religious tradition to another. If we fail that, we're really doomed. But also when it comes to science and religion, we can simply be certain that neither one of these, the great religious traditions of the world nor science, neither one is going to fade out in the foreseeable future. And so for there to be mutual understanding, appreciation, and possibly even respect, to my mind is really critical for human flourishing in our world today. So the topics that I'd like to bring together, as you can see from the title of the talk, are experience, reason, and faith, and this interface between science and spirituality has been a driving force in my life. It's a very personal issue. This is not simply one of many academic interests. I would say this is really one of my most central interests, and it has been ever since I left the University of California at the age of 21 and made my journey to the East. If this is important, that there be meaningful, fruitful, collaborative dialogue and engagement between science and religion, I think one of the most interesting questions to ask, first of all, is, okay, where are the barriers? One of our most eminent American historians is Daniel Boorstin. He wrote a number of books. One of those that I've read quite carefully is called The Discoverers, a history of humanity's discovery over roughly the last 5,000 years. So it's quite an ambitious and rather large volume. But he makes this statement in the preface of this book, extraordinary knowledge and erudition that went into it, but this was a principle that really captured my attention. And that is, as he surveys, as he provides his overview of humanity's discoveries of all kinds of things, from continents to galaxies, the nature of the mind, the genome, and so forth and so on, he found here was a principle teased out from historical investigation, so it's really an empirical conclusion, that it is illusions of knowledge, I love the phrase, illusions of knowledge and not ignorance that has historically proven to be the principal obstacles to discovery. There's something very innocent to my mind about ignorance. I was asked by Professor Kinsey, when it comes to consciousness, well, what about amoeba? Are they conscious or not? And I almost gleefully responded, I don't know. I just don't have any way of knowing. I don't even have an informed opinion. So if you talk about dogs, yeah, I'll say dogs are conscious, but when you get to amoeba, I just don't have any pretense of knowing. I just don't know. And that there's kind of a relief in that That is, no one can refute me. There's no argument. We have a very sharp philosopher here. But she couldn't refute me on that point. Yes, you do know. Yes, you know. No, I really don't know. And so knowledge is, that is, ignorance is kind of like a fertile field. You recognize that there's nothing sown there, and you're ready to learn something. So if I see some empirical evidence coming along that indicates that amoeba are or are not conscious, I have my ears wide open. I don't have an opinion. But the illusions of knowledge, Mark Twain summed this up in a nice vernacular phrase, very quintessentially Mark Twainian, and that is, it ain't what you don't know that gets you in trouble, it's what you do know that just ain't so. It's that illusion of thinking that we know anything at all, any particular item, about which in fact we have nothing more than belief, simply assumptions. But nevertheless, we are sure, we're sticking by our guns, this I know, this I know. It happens on both sides of the fence, if we speak of the fence demarcating science and religion. In religion, I'll take one of many examples. People that say, I know that every book in the Bible, the Old Testament, New Testament, everyone was chosen, selected in because of the will of God. The hand of God was guiding those who codified the Old Testament and the New Testament, and that's simply it. It's God's word, and moreover, being God's word, every word is literally true, and this I know to be the case. And therefore, whatever kind of evidence comes up from geology, evolution, and so forth, the universe really is 7,000 years old, and this I know to be true. Well, that may be true. It would be very shocking to me if it's true, but it's a belief. It's not knowledge. So religious people do it. Christians have no monopoly on illusions of belief. Scientists do it, or people who are followers of science or embrace the metaphysical worldview of scientific materialism. And they will say, and I've heard this being said, human beings are just animals. There's nothing to human existence apart from our animal nature. Every aspect of us is biological. Every possible state of consciousness is nothing more than a function or emergent property of the brain. And at death, you are absolutely terminated. And this I know. No, you don't. You may speak with great conviction, maybe with a very deep voice. But you don't know that. The scientific evidence is not sufficient. So you've gone beyond knowledge to belief. I have nothing wrong, no problems with belief, but let's not conflate it with knowledge, because we see when we get the hard-nosed people, the hardcore religious fundamentalists, whether Christian, Buddhist, Muslim, and then the hardcore, frankly, materialist fundamentalist, the Richard Dawkins, the Christopher Hitchens of the world, and so forth, you see there's simply no ground at all for meaningful dialogue. And to my mind, a major blockage is there, is the conflation of belief with illusions of knowledge. So I'd like to go first of all to faith. And these three types of faith, this categorization comes from Buddhism, but I think for those many of you who in the audience who are not Buddhist, or not necessarily particularly interested in Buddhism, these may still resonate. But this is classic Buddhism, in which Buddhism really, in this tradition, faith plays a very important role. There's a faith of appreciation. So each of these is going beyond knowledge. When we speak of faith, we're not talking about knowledge, we're talking about something that may complement knowledge. Maybe, how do you say, confront knowledge in an antagonistic way. A faith of appreciation, of yearning, and belief. To flesh this out, I'd like to give two examples. First of all, we've all heard of unconditional love. We've heard it described. Books have been written on it. There's a lovely book called, by Stephen Post, I think his name is, Unlimited Love. So about unconditional love. And one may read about it, read books on it, articles. One may then read the life stories of people, Christian and otherwise, who really to a very high degree have embodied, manifested unconditional love in this world. And by so doing, by reading about this, one may develop a real appreciation, thinking, you know, I think there's really something to this. This was not simply some libido instinct. It wasn't just attachment. It wasn't just craving. It wasn't selfishness. No, this was really unconditional love. And even though it's beyond one's own experience and beyond one's knowledge, a type of faith may arise there, a faith of appreciation, a faith of admiration. It's not blind, it's informed, but it's beyond one's own knowledge. And as one dwells in this faith and one allows it to grow and really feels that what a marvelous ideal, what a wonderful thing to realize, these other people seem to have realized it. Jesus himself seems to have realized it perfectly. Others emulated it to a large extent. What a wonderful thing for me to strive for such an ideal. And so one maybe go beyond the faith of appreciation or admiration to the faith of yearning. Might I too follow in the footsteps of the great individuals such as Jesus himself, or great saints of the Christian tradition, the Jewish, the Buddhist, and so forth. But yes, let this be a focal point for my life. This I will utterly embrace. This is a noble and utterly meaningful, absolutely meaningful ideal. That's faith. But now it's gone beyond admiration, it's to yearning. It can be life-transforming. And then, in addition to that, there is the faith of belief, and that is, have we realized unconditional love? Well, I'd have to say from my perspective, no. But do I believe, and I will now speak very personally, do I believe that there is such a thing as unconditional love that is constant like space itself, that does not go up and down depending on whether people are pleasant, unpleasant, whether they are virtuous or unvirtuous, truly unconditional? Do I believe that that does exist in the world? My answer is yes. I can't say I know it, but I do believe it. A Christian, a very devout Christian, might say, not only do I believe in the existence of unconditional love, but I believe God is the very essence of unconditional love and the source of unconditional love. And that is my belief. One could say, that's belief. Now, I found nothing irrational there, but none of those were assertions of truth, of knowledge. They may be truth, but not knowledge, but they were faith. I'll give another type of faith. One may read about as a youth Darwin's theory of evolutionary biology and see, as so many people did even when he first came out with it, what a majestic theory. It has such extraordinary explanatory power. It really makes sense. And then you add Mendel, you see genetics arising, you see Crick and Watson coming, the double helix. You see, wow, this has tremendous explanatory power, not to explain the origins of life or the meaning of life, but simply how do species evolve and mutate over time in response to changes in the natural environment. What a majestic theory. Now, of course, it's not testable. You can't put put it into a laboratory and test it like the inverse square law of gravity, but one may develop a faith of appreciation, of admiration. What an extraordinary theory with such explanatory power. And then as one appreciates it more and more as a youth, one might feel, gosh, that's such a magnificent theory. I'd like to become a biologist. I'd like to follow in Darwin's footsteps, perhaps even as a devout Christian. But I'd like to really see, understand this more thoroughly, deeply, and see how this might interface with my own religious faith. A faith of yearning may arise. And then a faith of belief, I really think Darwin was right. Not as in terms of necessarily an entire all-encompassing worldview, but nevertheless, a lot of truth is here. And this is something important to understand our own existence as a human species, as primates, as mammals, and our interrelationship with the rest of the animal species on our planet. So, faith of all three kinds appears in religion, it appears in science, and it appears elsewhere as well. I work with a lot of scientists, and including a number of research projects, primarily with cognitive scientists, but again, my background was in physics, and I have very fruitful relationships, friendships, professional collaborations with physicists as well. And I encounter some of them, especially those who are not religious. If I ever use the word faith and science in the same sentence, they bristle. They don't like that word. They think, no, faith is for people, not us. We scientists, we the scientific community, we'll deal with empirical fact, with logic, with reason. Faith is what those religious people do. But I do not use the word faith, as you can already tell. I do not use this as a pejorative. Many scientists do. Many materialists do. And many materialists, again, the Hitchens, these various people of that sort, think that faith is simply illicit, like it's an expression of brain damage or something like that. As you can tell, I do not go along with that, and of course, I would suggest as a one-liner, if there were no faith in science, scientific research would grind to a halt overnight. But in the following way, call it faith, call it confidence, call it trust. These are all very adjacent words. I'm going to stick with faith, because I think it, in fact, can be a uniting factor, and not simply something that religious people do, or ignorant, stupid people do, but scientists must have faith in the discoveries of their predecessors. And that is, my field in terms of being professionally trained was physics. When I was there as an undergraduate at Amherst, I had no time to replicate every scientific discovery in the field of physics that had gone on for the preceding 400 years. I would have been an undergraduate for 400 years. Too long. So you have to rely upon the integrity, the intelligence, the honesty, and so forth, the acuity, the intellectual rigor, and both as well as the empirical rigor of preceding scientists, and you build on them. That's what Einstein did, that's what Newton did, standing on the shoulders of giants and so forth. If that faith collapsed and you thought maybe they were lying, maybe they fudged their data, I better check, you just spend all of your time checking all of the discoveries, conclusions made by preceding generations. In other words, nobody get anywhere. It's not only in the discoveries, the insights of your predecessors, but we now know, especially in the 20th or 21st century, that science has become so specialized. In your undergraduate work, you get the big picture, but then as soon as you're in graduate work, in physics, are you a theoretical physicist, an experimental physicist? Within experimental physics, what type? Are you doing atomic physics, elementary particle physics, plasma? You know, what are you doing? And then you get a very sharp picture of that particular specialty. But in the meantime, these individual disciplines of physics do not operate autonomously. Physics, of course, these multiple disciplines act in interrelationship with each other. You have to trust. You have to trust. When you pick up science, you pick up Nature, Scientific American, and the many, many other professional journals within the scientific community, and articles are published by these very distinguished journals. You trust them. You say, but I saw it in Science, it must be true. I have read now multiple times that there are exoplanets. That was a speculative issue 20 years ago, but now about once every month or so, astronomers are discovering one more exoplanet, that is a planet that is revolving about some other distant star. About 400 at the last count. Well, this is published in peer-reviewed journals, and the research has been done by people at MIT and so forth and so on. So I say, oh, good, that's an interesting discovery. I'm glad to know that we're not the only planet around. But that is faith, because I don't have time, and the scientific community itself doesn't have time to be cross-checking all of the research being done by their contemporaries. Faith is absolutely indispensable. And then moreover, scientists are using instruments of measurement, of observation, of experimentation. Galileo created his own technology. Show me the physicist, the chemist, the biologist nowadays who's designing his own MRI, his own EEG, his own instruments of observation. That's a different discipline. It's an engineering, it's technology. The scientist must trust. The brand name must trust that the technology does what it is designed to do. Without that, again, everything would grind to a halt. And then, as we all know, anybody who's worked with science, you know it's very expensive. Good research is really expensive. Somebody's got to pay for it, and you can bet your bippy it's not the scientists. It's us. To a very large extent, it's us. It's the NIH, it's the NSF, it is national agencies distributing grants with our tax money, which means we better have faith, we, the American public, the European public, and so forth. If we don't have faith that these scientists are coming up with something important that is true, that maybe have practical applications, we won't pay for it. Congress won't pay for it. In which case, public, we are in no position to corroborate all of these many discoveries. We read the scientific journals, we read the science sections of New York Times and so forth and so on. But if the public lost faith in science, science would grind to a halt. It's too expensive. They're not going to pay for it. So there we are. It's saturated by faith. And if faith in any one of those three areas dissolved, science would grind to a halt. Of course, faith is not confined to science. Now go to the other side. And this is true really of religious traditions around the world. For those following a particular tradition, Christianity, Taoism, Buddhism, and so forth, it is widespread, it's expected, that if you're following a certain path or a certain religion, a faith, that you have faith, confidence, trust in the revelations, the truth assertions by, whether it is a unique individual, or one who's claimed to be unique, as in Jesus the Christ, or the prophets of the Old Testament, or the Buddha as an enlightened one, the great rishis of the Hindu tradition, and so forth. They have made many truth claims, and so those who follow in their footsteps, who embrace their worldview, their insights, do so in faith. But it's not just the founders. It's not just faith in Allah by way of Muhammad, or faith just in Buddha. But there's a lineage in the Christian tradition, the apostolic tradition. Faith that over these centuries and centuries and centuries since the founders of these religions, that the telephone lines didn't get mucked up. And that is, the word did not get distorted. That we're still getting the message through from those who actually knew what they're talking about. And that is crucial. The Muslim faith states Muhammad knew what he was talking about, that he had access to God. He was getting the word of God. He knew what he was talking about. Jesus, certainly the assertions are, he knew what he was talking about. It was not a matter of faith or belief in him. It was he knew what he was talking about. The Buddha spoke out of, allegedly, knowledge, not belief in some predecessor and so forth. So the notion that the buck has to stop somewhere, there's someone back there, a rishi, a prophet, a messiah, someone who knew very important truths about existence as a whole, our own existence, and then that the telephone lines, going back centuries to that individual, that they're uncorrupted, they're not distorted, and moreover, in the optimal circumstance, at least many of the insights have in fact been replicated. And so this is where we go to the third point here, and that is faith that the insights and realizations of past adepts, if we can call Jesus an adept, Buddha an adept, can be replicated in the present. There are many Christians who believe this, and there are many Buddhists, and there are many Taoists and so forth, that they were not sui generis, that is, their insights were not absolutely isolated, unique to one particular individual. In the case of Buddhism, it's very, very obvious. The Buddha taught the Four Noble Truths and so forth for other people to investigate them for themselves and replicate the discoveries that he had allegedly had made. So faith plays an enormously important role in both science and religion. And I love this phrase from William James's text, his treatise, The Will to Believe. I think it is enormously important. And speaking as a non-religious person, he was not a Christian Buddhist, he did not follow any particular faith, but an extraordinary openness to it, a receptivity and a respect for the great religious traditions and religious experiences of the world. And he comments here, where preferences are powerless to modify or produce things, faith is totally inappropriate. And that is, for example, in terms of the law of gravity, is it an inverse square law or an inverse cube law? Which? Well, if you've never heard, what the right answer is, you might think, but I have so much faith, it really should be cube because it's a trinity, it's three. Three is a magical number, it really should be an inverse cube law, and I'm sure it must be the case. That faith is just not warranted. Keep it out. Because whatever it is, it just doesn't have any relevance to what you believe. Just do the measurements. And if it's an inverse square law, so it is. If it doesn't turn out to be a nice, neat number, maybe it's, inverse pi law or something. Well, let it be what it is, but just keep an open mind. But don't go and try to tilt the deck or stack the deck before you go in. So he acknowledged that's good science. Go ahead and have a working hypothesis if you wish, but don't go in prejudiced, because that's going to make for bad science. It's going to make for tendentious science, where you're really trying to prove what you already believe. Not such a good idea. On the other hand, there's a class of facts that depend on personal preference, trust, or loyalty for actualization. There are some things that are true, become true, are known to be true, if and only if we first believe them to be true. This is a different type of fact. And he said, in such cases, faith is not only licit and pertinent, but essential and indispensable. The truths cannot become true till our faith has made them so. To my mind, that's an extraordinarily important and true statement. We can look at trivial examples. Is it possible for a human being to run a 4-minute mile? We know the answer, but we didn't always know the answer to that one. Is it possible to break the speed of light and not, be shattered in a whole bunch of little disorganized molecules? There are many questions. Is it possible in athletics to, jump higher, to run faster, and so forth? Is it possible to so finely focus light of a particular frequency that it could be used for surgery? If you don't believe it, if you're just sure, it's probably not true. Or I just don't know. You're kind of like, I don't know. You probably will never get up the gumption to see. And so there are certain things, accomplishments, that if you have faith in them, the young person who believes, I could make it to the Olympics, the aspiring contemplative that thinks, I could really follow in the footsteps of St. Augustine, of Nicholas of Cusa, the great contemplatives of the Christian past. I could follow in the footsteps of the Buddha. I could develop unconditional love if I utterly put my heart and mind to it, devoted my whole life to it, I could definitely approach and possibly even realize unconditional love. I believe that. Imagine such a conviction arising. I strongly suspect that you'll realize such depths of love if and only if you believe it's possible. If you start out with the working assumption of Freud that all manifestations of love are simply, suppressed expressions of the libido, the chances of ever getting the inspiration up to develop loving kindness or unconditional love, I think will never happen. If faith isn't there, it won't happen. Your faith has made it not happen. Your faith that it can't happen will prevent it from happening. So there's multiple modes of faith, times when it is utterly licit, other times when it is illicit. But moving beyond faith, I'd like to move to something that I would say is knowledge, but it can be easily conflated with faith. And I'm going to look at three types of knowledge here. Knowledge based on testimony, on inference, and on perception. This, once again, is coming straight from Buddhist epistemology. If I can ask for a show of hands, how many of you know where you were born? What city or town or even state? Pretty much everybody. Yeah, that came as no surprise. I'll put my hand up too. So in my case, it was Pasadena, California. Now, if you ask me, how do you know that, Alan? When you came out of your mother's womb, did you look around and see the city sign? Did you pop out and say, oh, Pasadena, welcome to Pasadena, here's the population? Is that the first thing you did, just to make sure, you know? And of course, being born with reading capacity. And nope. So, in other words, from my own experience, I could have been born in Timbuktu or Kalamazoo. How would I know? You know, I was just crying and pooping in my pants at the time. So I had no way of knowing where I was, and, you know. But I know somebody who I have every reason to believe, I mean, really compelling evidence to believe, she knew where I was born. She was an adult. She could read signs and city boundaries and so forth. My mom is an expert. My mom is an authority on where her first son was born. And I've relied upon her. I see absolutely no reason, it seems to be utterly unreasonable, illogical, for me to believe that she misled me on that. In fact, I was born in Santa Monica, but she just wanted to keep it from me. She had no reason to deceive me. She had privileged access to that knowledge. She, perhaps more than anybody else, she knew where she was when the water broke, you know. And so, but I will have no qualms about saying, gee, I think probably, most likely I was born in Pasadena. I don't need to hedge my bets on that one. I'll just say, I know I was born. How do I know? I'm relying upon the testimony of a person who I am utterly convinced, based upon good reason, she knew where she was and she reported accurately to me. So I'm taking that as a trivial example. But one of many, there are so many cases where we say, I know. I won't ask for another raise of hands, but how many of you know that the earth goes around the sun and not vice versa? Without going into relativity theory, thank you. Most of us would say yes. How many of you, so we could cite a whole bunch of things, and they say, but how do you exactly know that? Give me the evidence, give me the reasoning, persuade me, because I really think the sun goes around the earth. Probably many of you couldn't do it, because you're relying upon the testimony of some really very distinguished physicists, whole generations of them. And so, how is this different from faith? Or simply belief, the faith of belief. And I would suggest here that the line is drawn, granted that it's a somewhat fuzzy line, and that is one first ascertains that a person, as in the case of my mother, or some other authority, like the physics department at MIT, is a valid source of knowledge. That is, we have good reason to believe that some article published in Science, written by a MIT physicist, describing the discoveries he's made with a collaborative team working with Caltech, Harvard, and Stanford, that when they report, this is what we found, I would say, oh, I just learned something new. I know this now, that they found now 400 exoplanets. And so I know this. How do I know it? Because they're in a position to know what they're talking about. They've earned that respect. They've earned that confidence. And so I would say, yes, I know many things about the world based upon the testimony of scientists, my mother, and so forth and so on. And then as we put this to the test, on the one hand, there are epistemic criteria, and that is really checking up. So if I really got skeptical here, maybe they were just fudging the data. Maybe, because that does happen occasionally, cold fusion and so forth. In science, that they fudge the data. That can happen. But if one investigates epistemically, you can see, well, did they have good reason for doing so? Or there are other claims where the primary criterion of testing the validity of a statement is going to be pragmatic. And that is, for example, if someone claims, I've created the first laser. It took place back in the 1950s. And it can do extraordinary things. It sounded outlandish. It sounded like Buck Rogers at the time. And this is how you develop a laser. It is possible. And lasers can do amazing things, as we know so well now, become a commonplace. Then you can say, well, that's an interesting idea. How do you make a laser? And then you put it to the pragmatic test and see whether you can make a laser and whether it works. So there are multiple ways of testing knowledge based upon testimony. But I would say this is more than simply faith or belief. I don't say that I simply believe I know where I was born. I just say what I know. And it's based upon really good testimony. And then there's inference. This is, again, a set of Buddhist typology here, or classification. Inference based on the nature of phenomena. So I'll give you a Buddhist example here. It is said in Buddhism that all phenomena that arise independent upon causes and conditions are themselves impermanent. By the very fact that something like a glass of water arose independent upon prior causes and conditions implies that it, and necessarily implies, this is an inference based upon the nature of this conditioned phenomenon of glass of water, that it's impermanent. That sooner or later, this will no longer be a glass of water. All I need to do is loosen my fingers, and it will no longer be a glass of water. But even if I'm careful, honor my hosts here, don't break the glass of water, it's just a matter of time. And we already know this. This is certainly true. Already we know that glass of water is not a permanent phenomenon. It's not immutable. And we don't have to wait. We know it by the very nature of a glass of water. It's impermanent. It's subject to destruction. So there are many things of that sort. By knowing the nature of a certain phenomena, we know by inference other qualities of the said phenomenon. And then there's inference based on causality. This happens all the time in science and in everyday life. We see, to take a Buddhist example, we see smoke billowing up from yonder hill, on the far side of yonder hill. And it's very good evidence that it's smoke and not a dust storm. And then we draw an inference, oh, there must be a fire on the far side of the hill. Because that's smoke, and smoke always comes from combustion. There must be combustion. I don't see it, but I would say it's not merely a matter of faith or belief, but I know there's fire on yonder side of the hill. And how do I know that? Because I've seen a lot of smoke and I've seen a lot of fire, and if I've really investigated, I see that smoke uniquely emerges from combustion. It doesn't come from a sandstorm. It doesn't come from dust. It doesn't come from a lake with fog and so forth. Wherever there's something in the very nature of smoke that it can only arise from combustion. And therefore, because of that strong correlation, where there's smoke, there's always the originating combustion, whether it's smoldering, whether it's clear flame. Then based upon that, I know something that's beyond the scope of my perception. Now, that happens all the time, done scientifically and in everyday life. But it's based upon knowing that smoke simply cannot arise without there being a causal combustion giving rise to it. And perceiving that. One can imagine there might be a person who has never seen fire. A very protected individual. And sees smoke. You see lots of smoke. That person simply cannot make that inference. They say, boy, it sure is smoky. That's it. No inference, right? But if you've seen the causal relationship, then the inference can be drawn. Well, this, to draw from the writings of one of the foremost epistemologists within the Buddhist tradition, Dharmakirti, 5th century or so of the Common Era, he looks into something quite interesting with enormous ramifications for modern science, and that is trying to draw inferences about a black box situation. And a black box situation is some domain of reality into which there is simply no perceptual access at all. So, hypothetically, in terms of metaphorically speaking, it's a black box. There's no way to get in there, poke inside and look in there. All you're seeing are the effects coming out. And his statement here, his assertion, true or false, it's a philosophical assertion, is that if you never have perceptual access to the cause of a particular effect, you can never infer the existence of the cause based upon the effect. In other words, you can look at smoke all day long. You can analyze smoke every which way, but if you never see fire producing smoke, you'll never be able to draw a valid inference that, in fact, fire is necessary for the production of smoke. Well, that sounds like kind of lightweight on the surface. But now let's take the black box of the entire natural world, the cosmos. Physicists such as Anton Zeilinger, a person I know rather well, brilliant experimental physicist at the University of Vienna, he's made the following statement, that all that we scientists, and he's speaking especially of physicists, all that we really know about the natural world consists of the information that we derive from our measurements. Any statements about the objective world, the physical world, the world that's really out there, as it exists independently of all systems of measurement, independently of all conceptual frameworks, all assertions are not merely false, they are meaningless. Because we have no way of putting any such assertion to the test of experience. You put a test of experience, and all you get is more information based upon a measurement. So even Edward O. Wilson made this comment in terms of speaking of metaphysical realism, that what is nature like in and of itself, independent of all observations, experimentations, measurements, and so forth, how closely do our theories, scientific theories, correspond to some independently existing, absolutely objective universe? He said, well, that's an issue of faith. We can't test it. And he's quite right. At least he agrees with Dharmakirti, and I think they're both right. So that's inference. Very powerful, but it does have limitations when you have no access to the causes. Trying to infer the effects, or trying to infer the causes based upon effects is rather dubious. And then we go to knowledge based on perception. I know for a fact that I'm holding a wristwatch in my right hand. So that's fair enough. And so perception, we know colors, we know tastes, we know objects, glasses of water and so forth, by way of the five senses. And I've had some interesting conversation with Professor Kinshi over yesterday. The type of evidence that we get as we look outwards by way of our five physical senses, and the extension of our physical senses by means of the instruments of technology, radar telescopes, electron microscopes, X-rays, and so forth and so on. This is the realm of empirical evidence. And I think most scientists would agree with this. The evidence that we get from third-person perspectives, it's consensual. Multiple people use the apparatus, multiple people use their eyes and so forth, and we get empirical knowledge that is outward, it's physical, it's quantifiable, it's objective, and we directly know it. So Galileo, starting the true science of astronomy, prior to which there was pretty much folk astronomy and a lot of astrology, looking through his 30-power telescope, gazing up at Jupiter, he saw, directly perceived, moons, these little dots of light going around Jupiter. And so he saw, directly perceived that Jupiter has moons, which went entirely against the core principles of Aristotelian astronomy. So Aristotle was wrong. That was rather a bitter pill to swallow for many. But he had let the authority of Aristotle be trumped with his own eyes. That was rather a daring move. And he made other statements, such as his observations of the craters on the moon, spots on the sun, and so forth. They shouldn't have been there. According to Aristotle's vision of the heavens, they were there. Tough luck for Aristotle. So that's empirical. Something is often overlooked even in modern cognitive science, and I do deal, and I'm not a cognitive scientist, but I do engage with them a lot, so by osmosis. I studied cognitive psychology somewhat when I was at Stanford, and the phrase mental perception doesn't even come up. It's nowhere to be found. We have 5 modes of perception, and then we have our faculty of reason, of imagination, of memory, and so forth, but the notion that we have 6 modes of perception doesn't come up. And in the textbook that I studied by Anderson, Introduction to Cognitive Psychology, in the preface, he discussed introspection, said it didn't work, and now let's move on. And the rest of the book was all excluding introspection, the direct monitoring of our own mental states and processes, like, that didn't work. And I was just with a cognitive neuroscientist last April, very distinguished person from NYU, and she defined metacognition as thinking about thinking. So not a monitoring of your mental states, but just thinking about thinking. I said, well, that's your definition, that's not my definition. And so in the Buddhist framework, and as we'll see shortly, this is absolutely not confined to the Buddhist framework, we do directly perceive mental states and processes. I gave the example yesterday, and I just, a roundtable conversation, that I'm visualizing right now. I'll do it again. I'm visualizing a piece of fruit, a particular type of fruit. What's it going to be today? Okay, got one. There it is, but I can see it. I can see the image, I see the color of it, and I would say I have privileged access to the type of fruit that's appearing into my mind's eye right now. For you, it's metaphysical. And you just have no, I'll tell you what it is. What's coming to my mind right now is a tangerine, but you had no way of knowing that. And you could bring out your MRI, the EEG, the behavioral measurements, you could, all kinds of scientific measurements, and you could look at all kinds of brain correlates taking place, but you won't tease out tangerine. And so, am I visualizing a tangerine or not? For you, that's metaphysical. It's beyond the scope of empirical corroboration or repudiation. For me, I know I'm visualizing a tangerine. It's direct perception. I can see the mental image. Where this is especially flagrantly obvious is in the midst of a lucid dream. A dream in which you are dreaming and you know that you're dreaming while you're dreaming. You're directly perceiving the dreamscape, the people in the dream, the events taking place in the dream, your emotions and desires in the dream. You're not inferring them. It's not a matter of faith. It's direct perception, and your 5 physical senses are dormant. There are 6 modes of perception. And modern cognitive science has largely forgotten that, which leads me to the conclusion that modern cognitive science, since the rise of behaviorism, John Watson in about 1910, that the modern cognitive sciences, behavioral psychology, cognitive neuroscience, is being dominated by people who are metacognitively impaired. And that's not a slur, it's a diagnosis. It's like finding a child in a classroom who's fidgeting and wild and so forth and saying, you have ADHD. That's not a put down, it's not ridicule. It's kind of like, you have a problem here, maybe you need some help. And I would say the cognitive sciences need some help. They should have more leaders in the field who, like William James and others, have exceptional, who are naturally gifted for metacognition, or let's make it even more interesting, maybe our metacognitive faculty, our faculty of mental perception, can be honed, trained, in which case we may develop a more and more sophisticated access to directly observing mental phenomena and not be limited to studying them indirectly by way of behavioral expressions and neural causes. So I would say there is mental perception, and this also gives rise to a type of knowledge. I know that I was looking at an image of a tangerine, not a belief, it wasn't faith. I chose it, I imaged it, and there it was. And then certainly a debatable area, and that is, do we have other types of direct perception? Some might call it intuition. Some might call it foreknowledge, extrasensory perception, precognition, remote viewing. Many people believe that these do exist. Many people believe that they do not. I think the evidence is not so compelling that we're forced to take either one of 2 sides. It's there. But it's a question, might that also be the case? And of course we can find reports of that around the world. The place where it's most fiercely denied is in the context of scientific materialism. So we come back to the issue of blockades, of barriers. What is impeding fruitful, mutually respectful discussion between science and religion? I would suggest that the power of dogma, which is closely related to illusions of knowledge, plays a very powerful role. I know that my father's a theologian, I know there's a whole field of theology called dogmatics, and that is not a pejorative term. So dogma does not necessarily imply a pejorative, does not necessarily have a pejorative sense, but we know in the common vernacular, if one person turns to another and said, you are so dogmatic, you're not saying you're a really good theologian. We know that something else is in mind, we know that is a pejorative statement. You're so dogmatic, you're just cling to your dogma so fiercely that I can't even talk to you. Well, we know that's pejorative. We know we're suggesting this is a fault on your part. And so I found this definition of dogma, and I find it very, very useful. It cuts across the boards from one discipline to another. So even though it's a rather long quote, let's look at it briefly. And that is, a dogma is a coherent, universally applied worldview. It's all-embracing, consisting of a collection of beliefs and attitudes that call for a person's intellectual and emotional allegiance. I say that's spot on. A dogma, therefore, has a power over individuals and communities, whether it's those following Mao Zedong in the Great March, communism, following Lenin, following Billy Graham, following Richard Dawkins, and so forth. Dogma crops up all over the place. A dogma, therefore, has a power over individuals and communities that is far greater than the power of mere facts and fact-related theories. Indeed, a dogma may prevail despite the most obvious contrary evidence. And commitment to a dogma may grow all the more zealous when obstacles are met. Thus, dogmatists often appear to be incapable of learning from any kind of experience that is not authorized by the dictates of their creed. So, I gave an example of Christian fundamentalism. Well, let's do tit for tat here. How about Buddhist fundamentalism? How about dogmatic Buddhists? Do they exist, or are we just, is it a dogma-free zone? Oh, I wish. The only problem with Buddhism is that there are human beings practicing it. I think it's one of the failings of Christianity as well. It's the doggone people that louse things up, you know? And so you get dogmatically minded people entering into a particular religious community, and lo and behold, the odor starts to spread. And so there are Buddhists of this sort. They cling, again, there are Buddhist fundamentalists, I guarantee it. They're looking at not only the recorded teachings of the Buddha that were written down some hundreds of years after he lived, but they're also maybe following a very particular lineage, a particular school. And that is, I'm a Tibetan Buddhist of Serache College of the Gelugpa order of Tibetan Buddhism that traces, you know, and this is the right one. You know. And those people of the other college, the Depung College, they're pretty good, but they really got it wrong. Because our college has the right text, the right sub commentaries. And it's literal and it's true, and boy, have I met Buddhists like that. It's literally true. So any evidence that comes up, well, what do those scientists know? What do those Hindus know? They're so confused. And let alone the Christians don't even come up, you know. And so it happens in Buddhism. There's no question about it. I want to give another example. I'd like to cite 3 marvelous branches of science which I think, to my mind, certainly are worthy of very deep respect. Evolutionary biology, tremendous explanatory power. To dismiss it altogether, I think is foolishness. So there's one really marvelous branch of science, evolutionary biology. A second one is genetics. Starting from Mendel, Crick and Watson onto the Human Genome Project, it's brilliant. It's outstanding science with a lot of practical applications and so forth. And take a third one, cognitive neuroscience. The technology is getting better and better and better. The correlations of mind and brain, more sophisticated. The applications for neurology, for neurosurgery, and so forth, getting really brilliant, really marvelous, great potential in each one of these 3. So I think I've expressed my respect. Evolutionary biology, genetics, and cognitive neuroscience. Now let's put them all together, call it Neo-Darwinism, and let's make a religion out of it. You take 3 branches of science, each one really quite exquisite, you bundle them all together, put it into a worldview, and it makes for one really crappy religion. That's my view. And the religion is, again, this is a collection of beliefs, attitudes that call for intellectual, emotional allegiance, but it's a universally applied worldview. So now, you name it, any aspect of human existence, religion, philosophy, art, science, love, compassion, you name it, play, everything now, every aspect of human behavior, every aspect of human existence has to be explained within the confines of evolutionary biology, genetics, and cognitive neuroscience. It's got to be. That's dogma. I think it's really one, how do you say, sorry excuse for a religion, but comprised of brilliant science. So it's where it goes beyond the facts to a worldview, demanding the person's intellectual and emotional allegiance despite any evidence that might come up to the contrary. So again, now speaking more broadly, dogmatism and religion, the notion that the source of our beliefs is infallible, whether it's the New Testament, whether it's the Bhagavad Gita, whether it's the Pali Canon, the Buddhist teachings, and those beliefs are uniquely true, so if you do not accept them, you're ignorant and deluded, maybe you're damned to eternal hell, or you just have to wander in samsara forever. But you're a sorry case if you do not accept, this belief. And not only this epistemic aspect, but the pragmatic, our practices are the only valid practices, and if you fail to follow them, you'll have no hope of achieving salvation, liberation, or enlightenment. That's dogmatism. Boy, there's just a ground for religious wars for millennia. We could just keep the wars going and going and going with that kind of basis. So there it is, but no surprise there. Let's go to the other side. Dogmatism, we could call it of science, but I think that's not really fair, because in America right now, more than half the scientists in the country believe in God, who answers supplicatory prayer. So they're not materialists, they are scientists, so I don't want to put them in that bucket. I would say scientific materialism can really be presented as a dogma, and here it is. Here at its core, articles of faith, and they are faith. These are not scientifically established facts. Here's one article of faith. The natural world is equivalent to the physical world. There is nothing in the universe that's not physical, and by the way, we define physical. And it is the sole source of knowledge, free of subjective biases. This is the objective world. What is true, it's out there. There are no supernatural or non-physical influences in the natural world. And I've really tried to find out, because I have a lot of friends who are scientific materialists, what exactly do you mean by supernatural? And they said, not natural. And they go into this loop really, really quickly. Angels, demons, God, heaven, hell. They said, well, how about consciousness? How about the tangerine I was just imagining? Is that supernatural? You can't measure it. And they get real hedgy really quickly. What those religious people believe in, that's what we don't believe in. So there's no supernatural. They start gagging when they say supernatural. But then you press them, what exactly do you mean by physical? Bearing in mind this category has shifted and evolved over the last 400 years of modern science. And once again, it gets really waffly really quickly. A probability wave in quantum mechanics. Hilbert space. An electromagnetic field. Where really, what is it really? Dark matter, dark energy, and so forth. Gets very dodgy. And the notion nothing exists except physical entities and their emergent properties, which are governed by chance and necessity. Again, an article of faith. We don't know that. And here we get to what is called methodolatry. The only way to know about the world is through physical evidence acquired by scientific measurements or the scientific method. These are all articles of faith, but they're gnarly. They're closed-minded. They're rigid. They're brittle. And it can make for a lot of elitism and arrogance, frankly. So there have been many people in the last century or so, and beyond, of course, who have tried to provide a solution for this whole interface between science and religion. And one of them is the very eminent and late biologist Stephen Jay Gould. And he very famously suggested that science and religion are comprised of non-overlapping magisteria. And here's how, this was the truce. He came as like a diplomat to the warring factions between, the creationists and the evolutionists and so forth and so on. And he said, there's no grounds for warfare. There's no grounds for conflict because I've got the solution. And the solution is that these are non-overlapping domains. That is, the kind of questions that scientists pose, the type of reality they're investigating and learning about, what they're doing is just fundamentally complementary to and does not overlap with what religious people do. So here's the solution, he says. The domain of science includes the empirical realm. Well, we know what that is. That's out there, right? The objective which can be observed from a third-person perspective and so forth, objective, physical, quantifiable. That's the domain of science. The sun, the moon, the stars, the planet, the laws of nature, and it addresses the questions of what the universe is composed of and how it works. That's what science is about. Religion, in contrast, the domain of religion consists of the realm of human purposes, meaning and value. And since those two do not overlap, you see now the war can all stop, conflict, now let's all be happy, stay in your room. Scientists don't mess with religion. Scientists, qua scientists, please don't tell us what our purposes, meaning, and value should be. So Steven Weinberg, you can stop saying that the more we understand the universe, the more meaningless it appears. That's not a scientific statement. Why don't you just not say that? Because it doesn't really mean anything. And so that kind of looked like, whoo, good, the war's over. Here's the diplomat, the peacemaker, and there's the solution. And I think it's entirely a bogus, utterly bogus solution. It doesn't go anywhere. It's an artificial, temporary truce that the more anybody looks into it, it won't fool anybody. First of all, with science. Anybody who's ever conducted any type of research in the last 50 years knows that you need money for it. And you know you're not going to pay for it. Charles Darwin paid for his own. But nowadays, nobody pays for their own. They're getting it from some kind of grant from someone, the Ford Foundation, the US government, what have you. And so you write your grant proposal. All the scientists I engage with, whenever I write to them saying, I'm almost finished with a grant proposal, I've got a deadline, Alan, as soon as the deadline passes, then I'll get back to you. It's like every week. It's one more deadline, one more grant proposal, and what are you hoping? That the agency to which you're submitting your proposal will value the type of research you want to conduct. And if they don't, you're not going to get the money. And so science has always been driven by values, whether we go back to Copernicus, Copernicus a churchman, Kepler a theologian, Galileo trained as a contemplative in a monastery as a youth of a devoutly religious man, Newton a devoutly religious man, a Protestant, Mendel a monk. The list goes on and on and on. Were they motivated by theological concerns? Well, as we'll see, the answer is emphatically yes. Are scientists nowadays motivated by values that stand outside of science? The answer is absolutely yes. They're going for the Nobel, they're going for tenure. There are values there. The kind of questions you pose are about the aspects of reality that you value to know about. It's always been true. And so science has always been saturated by values. It's never been divorced of values. When a bill comes up to Congress and they're asking for money for the NSF, they may say, but what's the purpose of the research? That's why we don't have the Hadron Super Collider that the Swiss and the European community has. It was too doggone expensive. American people didn't want to pay for it. They had a great big notion of designing one like that as good in Texas. The Congress said, no thanks, it's too expensive. The Europeans said, oh goody, we get to do it. And now there it is, chugging out its 3.5 trillion electron volts. So somebody valued it, somebody didn't. So science has never been value free. But now take religion. This is clearly a demarcation written by a person who's profoundly not religious. Because tell me the religious person who does not believe that, in the case of Christianity, that Jesus had anything true to say. That he just taught us about purposes, meaning, and value, but he didn't say, I'm the Son of God. He did not speak of God. He did not speak of truth. Well, that's just baloney. You can't read 10 pages in the New Testament without finding truth assertions. And that's true for every other religion in the world. We all know that to be true. Now, whether those truth assertions are true or false, that's another question. But the notion that religion is not even trying to make truth claims about the universe is simply absurd. So clearly that is, to my mind, a false piece. And actually, when he was speaking before, what was it? One very august scientific community, he knew he was speaking with insiders. He said, of course, I can have these non-overlapping magisteria because we scientists have won. That is, between science and religion, we won. So throw him a bone. Throw him a bone. Let him think that religion is comprised of a non-overlapping magisterium. Because in terms of who's in charge here, and is really knows about the nature of reality, it's us. Throw them some values. Let them be nice. So I would suggest that is an artificial solution. It never worked. I don't think he even believed it. I don't think anybody really believes it as soon as they scratch beyond the surface. How about going beyond the boundaries themselves? And I'm drawing entirely from the Christian tradition here. Very similar statements can be found in the Buddhist and other traditions as well. But St. Paul, I'm sure many of you who are Christian are very familiar with this phrase, I have been crucified with Christ, and I no longer live, but Christ lives in me. Suggesting Christ is not simply an object of one's attention, not simply someone else, not simply a historical figure, but this intimacy of this indwelling Christ, the duality, the radical absolute duality of Paul's own identity and the identity of Christ melting away, that one is present within the other. That same sentiment, that same view, that same assertion was made by Augustine of knowing God by way of knowing himself. It's not a direct quote, but it's very, very close. St. Augustine is one of many Christian contemplatives who made this general assertion that an effect of contemplative practice, of contemplative inquiry, is a clearer perception of the truths of the Catholic faith and a deeper insight into the secret things of God. And that is, he didn't speak of faith here. He said deeper insight, which suggests knowledge, into the secret things of God, such as the divine being and attributes, the very nature of God himself. One phrase that I loved, when I learned it as a graduate student, but this phrase, amor Dei, the love of God, the love of God. When I was a youth, it rather mystified me, I must say. And then I was reading of St. Augustine, and he unpacked the phrase amor Dei, love of God, as the passionate yearning to know God. Not simply affection, gratitude, or some kind of emotion towards God, but the passionate yearning to know God. And that for him was amor Dei. If I'm mistaken, I hope I'll be corrected soon. But this is what I've read. And so some direct insight, some deeper insight into the nature of God, the mysteries of the Trinity and incarnation. And now we get even more interesting. But a cardinal in the Roman Catholic Church, an envoy of the Pope of the time, an extraordinary polymath. The man was simply brilliant by any standard. And among his many areas of expertise, he was a very deep contemplative writer and philosopher. He wrote, "In God's light is all our knowledge, so that it is not we ourselves who know, but rather it is God who knows in us." So once again, a melting away of the boundaries between This is religious or religious knowledge or divine knowledge, transcendent knowledge, and this is our mere human anthropocentric knowledge and melting away at the divisions. So there's a drum roll from St. Paul to Augustine to Nicholas of Cusa in the 15th century. We see Galileo coming along in the late 16th, early 17th century, bearing in mind that as a youth he was trained as a contemplative in a monastery. He had a passion for it and he wanted to continue. If his father had paid for it, we'd never know of Galileo, the mathematician, the astronomer, and the physicist. We might possibly know of Galileo, the great contemplative. But his dad wouldn't pay for it. He said, I can't afford it. So go get a job, get an education, become a doctor. I don't want to become a doctor. So he became a mathematician, and then the rest is history, the founder of modern science. But he was deeply and explicitly motivated by theological concerns, values, and aspirations. And for him, this quest into observing and understanding the physical world was profoundly a theological, a spiritual quest, perhaps inspired by Nicholas of Cusa, who spoke of two paths to knowledge, one by going inwards, in the standard strategy of Christian contemplative practice, that of St. Augustine and others, but Nicholas of Cusa also suggested by looking outwards and fathoming the works of nature, that too can be a contemplative path to knowing the mind of God. Not only inwards, but also outwards, if after all this is God's creation. Galileo picked this up. Perhaps we may know the mind of the Creator by way of knowing the nature of the creation. And the aspiration here was an ideal of objectivity, and that is, by making objective observations and then mathematical analyses. Objective observations trying to replicate or approximate God's own view, the God's eye view of the natural world, and then analyzing and making sense of the observations in terms of God's own language, mathematics. The ideal was, the aspiration was, that man may conceptually transcend to a God's eye perspective on reality. It's called apotheosis, where the mind of man ascends to the mind of God. Any notion here of some strong demarcation between science and religion was the last thing on his mind. This was a theological quest. How separate, how different are these two avenues of inquiry? The contemplative, which is very internal, dealing with one's own mental awareness, and the methods, the strategies of science. Take contemplation, take it back to the Latin roots contemplatio. It is there defined in the Latin tradition as the means by which to devote one's full energy to revealing, clarifying, and making manifest the reality which has been sighted. It traces back to the Greek theoria, which means to behold. Certainly nothing there that would indicate, oh, that's antithetical to science. That's from the Greek, the Latin tradition, going back again to the Greek tradition, a very important term, noitos, very closely related to this notion of mental perception. According to the great Greek thinkers of antiquity, noitos is the cognitive faculty that directly apprehends, perceives non-sensuous, we might say non-empirical, phenomena, and discloses their intelligible meaning. A mode of inquiry, mode of observation that is not objective, but nevertheless may reveal very profound truths. And see if there's compatibility with one of the standard definitions of science, science consisting of principles and procedures for the systematic pursuit of knowledge involving the recognition and formulation of a problem and the collection of data through observation and experiment and the formulation and testing of hypotheses. To my mind, on the surface, when we deal with just linguistically, there's a total compatibility among these. Now, very briefly, this is an enormous topic, but if we go back to Buddhist framework, a Buddhist contemplative science, because Buddhism, after all, is about knowledge. The root of suffering is said to be ignorance and delusion. The remedy is knowledge, insight, discovery, not simply faith alone. The general strategy is your foundation is ethics, leading an ethical way of life, which gives rise to social and environmental flourishing. A lot could be said, I won't. Based upon that, the cultivation of the mind, cultivation of mental balance, qualities of the heart, of loving kindness, compassion, mindfulness, patience, equanimity, and so forth, but really honing the mind that achieves exceptional states of mental balance and psychological flourishing, and on the basis of that, then pursuing contemplative inquiry yielding insight that may lead to spiritual flourishing. Shifting over to Augustine, he spoke of spiritual flourishing, eudaimonia, human flourishing, as a truth-given joy. Clearly the aspiration of contemplatives around the world. And one often quoted statement by the Buddha, the mind that is established in equipoise comes to know reality as it is. And that is the honed, refined mind is your instrument of technology to gain deep truths, especially about the nature of yourself, your own consciousness, your soul, and ultimate reality. Occam's razor was wielded with great effect with the rise of modern science, shaving off many of the uncorroborated assumptions of medieval scholasticism that Galileo railed against. So did many, many others of the great founders of modern science. The theme of Occam's razor, it is vain to do with more assumptions what can be done with fewer assumptions. Good rule of thumb. I think Occam's razor has gotten pretty rusty over the last century or two, because now science has been, to my mind, profoundly encumbered with a whole bunch of uncorroborated assumptions that are taken as illusions of knowledge. What would be the result if we applied Occam's razor to the insistence, the dogmatic insistence, that mental phenomena have to be, must be, adamantly are just physical? That all states of consciousness, mental processes, are simply functions or emergent properties of the brain. It's an assumption. We don't know that. What about just throwing out the assumption and just flat out saying, you know, we don't really know. We don't really know the nature of consciousness, mental phenomena. We don't know exactly how they correlate with brain functions. We know there are correlations, but we don't understand the nature of them. Let's leave it as an open question. What would he lose by shaving off, frankly, all of the metaphysical assumptions of materialism, tossing them in the dustbin, and let science proceed with an open mind without this massive prejudice that everything has to be physical or an emergent property of the physical? In addition, if we added rigorous first-person contemplative inquiry to science, what might be gained? And I think that's an open question. Maybe a tremendous amount, maybe not much, but we won't know unless we try it. It's one of those areas of faith. If you're confident it won't give rise to anything, you won't try it. And we end, and I think I'm just about on time, end with a statement by one of my intellectual heroes, William James, who was such a polymath in his own right, a brilliant philosopher, deeply dedicated to empiricism and pragmatism, a psychologist, wrote one of the great tomes, The Principles of Psychology, a profoundly spiritual man who was not religious, wrote one of the greatest tomes on religious experience ever, varieties of religious experience. So he really felt at home in the realms of religion, of philosophy, of science, neuroscience, psychology, started the first neuroscience lab in the whole country. But he was an empiricist, but an empiricist in the old-fashioned sense of the term, that is not confined to objects out there, apprehended with physical systems of measurement or the physical senses, empiricism in the broader context of simply experience. And so he wrote this statement, let empiricism, and that is simply an emphasis on the primacy of experience, be it spiritual, contemplative, scientific, mathematical, artistic, and so forth. Let empiricism once become associated with religion. Let it become associated with religion as hitherto, through some strange misunderstanding, it has been associated with irreligion. And that is, scientists somehow have been given a monopoly on empiricism. And religious people, oh, you don't get any. You just get beliefs. Let's overcome that. If we let empiricism once again become associated with religion, with religious experience, I believe that a new era of religion as well as philosophy will be ready to begin. I fully believe that such an empiricism is a more natural ally than dialectics ever were or can be of the religious life. And so on that note, I will end. But I think he's making a point that is all the more relevant now than it was 100 years ago or so when he wrote this, is that for a person myself who is very interested in, really quite passionately dedicated to dialogue, fruitful collaboration between science and religion, what I see happening from my perspective, it's limited, maybe it's just utterly faulty, is that often I see beliefs colliding with beliefs. I see the beliefs of Richard Dawkins colliding with people who are adamantly convinced of the truths of creationism, and then it just sets up ridicule between the two. And so I see belief, dogma confronting dogma, belief confronting belief. If the Richard Dawkins of the world, if they could scrape off with Occam's razor, there are many assumptions about biology, and just get back to what do we actually know, and they know a lot. And if religious people could say, yes, we have these beliefs, but we're going to shelve those right now, and here's what we know, here's our experience, and that includes spiritual experience, not confining ourselves to empiricism in the modern scientific sense of the term. If we can come back to experience, we may find, especially when we become pragmatic, and scientists and religious people alike asking, we're faced with tremendous crises. We're faced with extraordinary, unprecedented challenges in the modern world. Now suddenly we're all in agreement. whether it's global warming, economic crises, environmental crises of a wide variety, the depletion of the fish in the ocean, the decimation of species, the horrid inhumanity of man against man cropping up again and again in the modern world. These problems are not just religious problems, and they're not just scientific problems. They are humanities problems, and we've really dumped an enormous burden on our next generation. And that's just fact. They have a tough row to hoe